Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and in this video I'm going to show you how to set up and wire the Lian Li Mini V2 with the installation of everything you can see here, including the wireless fans, the Lian Li Hydroshift 2, the RGB extension cables for your graphics card, and more besides. I'm going to talk to you about all the different setup and wiring process for the case and everything you need to know. I'll leave the specs of the build in the description and timestamps so you can jump to the relevant points. First of all, I'm going to break down the case and talk about some of the things of interest along the way and show you that, and then we're going to get into the nitty gritty. Now, this case comes apart with a few different thumb screws on top, but the glass panels, as you see, just pull out and then lift away really easily. The rear door also comes off really easily, just being tugged and lifted out of the way. But then you'll need to remove the SSD tray and cable hiding point here with a tiny little screw at the top. Make sure not to lose that screw because you will need to obviously put it back in later on. I'm going to show you how to install SSDs and hard disk drives back here as well, and you'll see a lot more detail in terms of the wiring, cable management, and more. But first, it's important to know some other things, like the fact that you have these blanking plates on the side panel. You get two of these, and this enables you to position your fans and then hide the gaps above or below, and choose where you put them. So you could put the fans at the top and have these plates at the bottom, for example, or the other way around, or one at the top and one at the bottom. At the rear here, you'll find a couple of cages. Now, these can be used for either SSDs or hard disk drives, and I'll show you installation later on, or you can just fully remove them. So there's some thumb screws to take out, and these additional screws to loosen ever so slightly, and then the cages can just be lifted out and removed. If you're not planning on using hard disk drives or SSDs, you could just fully remove these from the build and get them out of the way, giving you more space for your cable management. Or alternatively, you can tuck the cables into it, is one of the suggestions from Lian Li. But you'll see behind there's some Velcro straps. So actually removing them early in the build makes sense because you will then have more room to be able to tie your cables down and neaten things up as you go through the various steps of crafting in this case. One of the other things I wanted to show you is that the front panel power button and USB ports are located down at the bottom of the case down here. Now, you can actually reposition and move this. I want to show you the process for doing that in case you want to. Obviously, you can use the timestamps to jump forward in the video if you're not interested in this. But the step is basically, first of all, to tug the cables through the hole out of the bottom of the case first. So we need to remove those cables out of the way. Then you'll find there are various different screw points at the front here. There's about 4 screws to remove, and then you can shimmy this out of the front and take the front panel connector out of there entirely, and then obviously pull in the cables through that gap. What you'll then find is that you then need to unscrew the panel on the back of this so that you can move the cables to face in the other direction. So you'll see they're coming out from the right-hand side. You want to negotiate them around so they come out of the left-hand side instead. This will make sense in a second because when we reseat it in the case at the top, they'll then be running in the right direction, be able to neatly install them in the case and cable tie them out of the way so they don't cause a mess at the rear. So just shift that over a little bit, put the cap back on, screw it back into place and re-secure it. And that's the process for basically this step of readying the front panel connector to go into the top of the case. Now, you'll notice if you remove the top panel from the top of the case, you'll see that there's this little port here with a couple of screw holes in it. You don't actually need to take it off in order to access this, though, because you can actually unscrew the panel that's on there and remove it without doing so. There's a couple of screw holes that you'll find here and a couple of screws that need to be removed from the top panel, and then you can slide out that little blanking plate that's in there as standard. You can then rerun the cables through from the top and reinsert the front panel port and the power button set up here at the top instead of at the bottom of the case, and then just run the cables back through. Now, you can also, at this point, use that blanking plate to put it back down in the bottom and screw that back in with the screws that we removed earlier on from this, obviously covering over the hole that is now there. And basically, so you're just swapping these two panels around in terms of their position in the case. We then have the front panel connectors, as you can see, running out of the left side of that port and down the left edge of the case. I then took the time to use plastic cable ties to tie it to the edge to make sure it was out of the way of that side fan tray and anything else. It's just to neaten it up as much as possible so that they're tightened and out of the way there. And then we can sort those out later on, and I'll show you where to plug those in. Next, we have the accessories box, which, as you'll see, can be sectioned off with a number of different plastic sectioning parts that you can put in there, and then you can pop all the screws into it. So the screws come bagged up, all grouped together. But if you refer to the manual, you'll then be able to work out what screws are what, separate them out, put them into the different compartments, and that will make it easier during the build, because you'll then be able to go to the box and easily grab what you need to while referencing the manual to work out which screws are for what. And I'll show you which ones I'm using during the build as we go through and talk to you about that. But you can see it's really easy to work out what's what now based on this list and where they are. So for the next stage, I'd recommend setting up your motherboard and preparing things beforehand. I'm using the Tough Gaming Z890 motherboard that you can see here, and an Intel Core Ultra 7 265K. So basically it's seating that into the socket gently here, and you can see the process for doing that with the little gold arrow pointing down to the left corner of the socket, gently putting the lever back down and seating that in place. For the RAM installation, I'm using Corsair's Dominator Titanium RAM, but any RAM that you want to install, you need to make sure you install in the second and fourth slot. This is DDR5 RAM, and you need to make sure it's in those slots so that it runs at the maximum speed and that your PC will boot properly and recognize the RAM. If you use different slots, you won't experience the proper speeds out of this. I'm also adding into this system Corsair's Lighting Enhancement Kit, which is dummy RAM that you can put in the other slots, so you can look like you've got 4 sticks of RAM in there without the expense, and have some nice RGB lighting. We then have Samsung's 9100 Pro NVMe SSD. Recommend installing this on the top slot of the motherboard, which as you can see has a large heat shield there. Remove the heat shield, insert the drive into the port, secure it with the latch, remove any plastic sticker covering the thermal pad on the heat shield, and then reinsert that. You do need to make sure you use a heatsink to cool your drive properly. Before installing the motherboard, I recommend prepping further with other things. So I'm going to be using the Lian Li Hydroshift 2 LCD 360 fanless model, which obviously has a lot of different prep in order to install it. And I'd recommend doing this process of installing everything you're going to need for this before you install the motherboard in the case, because it makes life easier. So I'm going to show you the initial setup process for this now, and then later on we'll get on to putting fans on it and the wiring logic for it and installing it in the case. So for this build, we're going to use the Intel 1700 backplate. Now this will work with 1851 socket motherboards as well, which is the Z890 setup here. But you need to remove the little stickers first of all, so that the sticky tape is exposed at the back, and then when you seat the backplate over the back of the motherboard, this will secure in place. This is easy to do now rather than when it's in the case, because otherwise you'll have difficulty accessing that backplate potentially, depending on when you install the power supply, for example. Also, it makes this sort of thing easier as well with installing the socket setup for the bracketing at the top and bottom. So you see these little plastic clips that need to be put above and below the CPU socket, and then the metal standoff screws which go in place as well. Those have a little hole on one end, so watch out for that when you're installing them. They've got a little hole in one end of the screw because there's a little tiny screwdriver included with the Hydroshift cooler, which you need to use to secure these into the backplate that we've just installed. So secure all of those and tighten those up nicely, and then that's prepped so we can then put the motherboard into the case on the standoffs that are already in there. Looking at the manual, you can see the motherboard screws are marked as B. You've got 17 of them, and they've got that little raised bit on top of them. They're very small, but you need to install 9 of them, 3 across the middle, 3 across the bottom, 3 across the top of the motherboard to secure this motherboard to the case directly and make sure they're all tightened up nicely. And then you'll find that's well secured into there, and we can go about the installation of other things, which I'm going to start with the front panel connectors. So these are the power switch, the USB-A, USB-C connectors, and the 3.5mm jack. So with the USB-A and USB-C connectors, which you can see here, run them through some of those cable holes and then push them through the rubber area that you can see here towards the side of the motherboard. This will then enable you to plug them in on the right-hand side. Now, these are usually in the same place on most modern motherboards, just below the 24-pin power connector on the right-hand side here. The USB-C connection, which you can see here, will only plug in one way. So when you insert it, you should find it clicks into place. If you don't hear the click, you probably pushed it in the wrong way. The USB-A connector, meanwhile, is this plastic one, which has a little notch on it, so you need to make sure that's inserted the right way. Then for the front panel and HD audio connectors, the HD audio one will run to the F audio panel on the left-hand side of the motherboard that you can see. You'll notice that one pin's missing, so you can only put it in one way, and the same for the F panel connector, but this goes on the other side of the motherboard, which is on the right-hand side of the motherboard, as you're looking at it when it's in the case. So you can see it here, it's marked F panel, and again there's a pin missing, so you can only push it in one way, so it's pretty easy to install and to get it right. But just for a close-up view of that, you can see that inserted there. And so we're running both of those over and plugging those in, one on the right hand side and then the HD audio on the left, as I showed you. Next, we're going to set up the Lian Li Edge power supply unit and all the cables we need for this. So we're going to install it first of all. And to do that, you need to remove the back plate, which you can see here. This is a bracket for ATX power supply units. It has two screws holding it in place and then little clips at the bottom. So you need to lift it up and pull it out. Again, don't lose those screws. And then we'll secure this to the power supply unit using the 4 hexagonal screws that you can see here. You'll find those both with the power supply unit and in the accessories box that I showed you earlier on, so you should have plenty of them. But this mounts to the back of the power supply, as you can see here, with 4 screws in the various corners. So you'll find holes that you can line up there and then screw these screws into to secure it to this bracket. Normally you'd secure a power supply unit directly to the case, but you need this bracket because of the way this case is built to house power supplies that are ATX in form factor. It will then seep back into the case, notching in from the bottom. Don't forget that it's got a couple of clips at the bottom that you need to push in first of all there, and then reinsert it and screw those 2 screws back in that we put in earlier on. You'll see at this point that we've blocked the back of the motherboard, which is the reason why I said to do the backplate first of all before installing this. Now we're going to go for the 24-pin power cable. So this is split into 2 parts on one end, which plugs into the part on the power supply unit marked motherboard 18 plus 10P. So you can see that here. 2 different parts. You need to plug in both parts of that connector on this end of the power supply, and then the other end is a single connector that plugs into the motherboard. But make sure you do plug in both of these parts of the connectors. And then I'd recommend tidying up the cables, because this is quite a big cable, even on other power supply units. Obviously a lot of connectors on it, but you have these cable combs that you can run throughout it to neaten things up. And then obviously you can run it through the Velcro ties in the case to tidy it up as well, if you'd like. And it goes just above the USB connections that we plugged in earlier on. So this plugs in on the top right hand side of the motherboard, as you can see, and it will only plug in one way around because there's a plastic clip on one side of it that hooks over the port. So when it's pushed fully into the port, you'll find that it clicks in and is held in place solidly there. Make sure it is fully pushed in though. You don't want it to be loose, otherwise your PC won't power on. At this point, you can also tidy it up with those cable combs again to neaten things nicely. So it's really tidy at the front and any of the cable shame is hidden away at the rear. But I'd also recommend making use of Velcro ties if you can, or plastic cable ties here as well, because you do want to tighten and tidy things up as much as possible. Next, we have 2 8-pin CPU power cables, and these are for the top of the motherboard, and you'll want to use both of these installing in the top left corner, as you'll see here. Most motherboards have the same logic where you'll need to plug these cables in. You'll find that these are marked PSU on one end, and they need to plug into the ports marked CPU and PCIe. So any of those up there, I've chosen these ones at the bottom of the power supply, just so we can hide away the majority of the excess of the cables out of the way of the front. They can run up through the top Velcro ties that you can see here, so we can neaten those up and get them out of the way, and then run them through the holes at the top of the case so that we can then access the ports here and plug those in. You'll see it's easy to do all of these things before you install the all-in-one cooler, for example, so you can easily access those, and so that you can tidy up the cables with those cable combs again and make it look nice and neat. You can then use the Velcro ties to secure this down and neaten that up as well. And that's the motherboard powering sorted out. So for the most part, really easy. So the next stage is then to remove the bottom fan tray. Notice I've also pulled out the dust shield at the bottom as well. I'd recommend getting that out of the way. But with 2 screws, you can then remove the angled bracket from the bottom of the case, where we're then going to install fans on it. I'm using reverse blade SL Infinity wireless fans, so these will then be intake fans because of the way reverse blade fans work. I've got a separate guide on reverse blade fans and on the wiring of these fans. So if you find any of this confusing, well, I'm going to show you the basic logic for them, in that they click together nicely, as you can see. You then need to make sure that you then remove the screw hole covers from the bottom of the fans, because what we're going to do is obviously to seat the fans on top of the bracket and screw it in from below. So we want to screw all those fans in. Now that they're sorted out there, you can see that you can line up the screw holes there and then use the fan screws that came with the fans to then secure it to the fan tray. And once that's done, you'll then see I've secured all these screws into that, and we have it set up and ready. Now on either end of the fans, you'll find a connector that will allow you to then plug in this wireless receiver. The wireless receiver has 2 cables that enable you to connect the fans to your system, but essentially you need to plug it into one end of the fans. I'd recommend on the left hand side, because that will then mean that you can easily hide the cables away at the bottom, run them through to the rear and tidy things up so that they can't be seen. But you have 2 cables here, and it's recommended that you plug these into the chassis fan headers or system fan headers on the motherboard, or my recommendation is to use the SATA power connector adapter, which I'll show you later on instead. But if you want to use motherboard connections, you're looking for CHA fan or SYS fan. On the bottom middle of the motherboard, usually you should find multiples of these, but you need to make sure that both connectors for the group of fans is plugged in to ensure that they're getting enough power. Again, I've got a separate wiring guide on these fans if you need it, which goes into a lot of detail on them. I'll link to that in the description. But once that's done, you can then seat this back into place and then use those 2 screws to re-secure the bracket to the bottom. And so that's fully set up there. Now for the side mounting of intake fans, I'm using 2 more intake fans here. So these are reverse blade fans again, same fans, same logic, but you can only fit 2 120mm fans here. As I mentioned earlier, though, you can choose where you're going to position them. So if you want to put them in the middle, you could use the blanking plates above and below here, for example, or you could put them both at the bottom and then put the blanking plates above, or both at the top and put the blanking plates below. It's your choice where you set it up. I went for the middle because I think it looks the nicest. But again, though, we need to make sure we've got that wireless receiver connected to one end of the fans, top or bottom. I went for bottom because I thought it'd be easier to hide the cables away out of view down the bottom. You wouldn't easily be able to see them. So put the connector in, run the cable to the rear, and we'll plug them into the motherboard or into the SATA power connector, as I'll show you. But again, we need to remove the little screw hole covers and then screw it in from the back. So all 8 screws secured here into the rear of the fans to secure them to that back plate. So make sure they're ready and set up. Then I'm installing a standard SL Infinity wireless fan to the rear as an exhaust fan. Now it's worth noting with all these fans, there are some clips that you can remove if you're not adding them to the group. You can just twist those off so you can get them out of the way. Also, don't forget to remove the screw hole covers so you can actually mount these fans. And there's little plates here that you can cover the connectors, so the pins aren't touching any metal points on the case and also don't get broken. So the ones you're not going to be using, you can put the blanking plate on and then the connector will go on the other side. So in this instance, I'm putting the wireless receiver on the top, and then I'm going to run the cables through the rear up where that 8-pin power connectors are that we put on the top of the motherboard, just putting it through that gap for the moment and then securing this fan to the back of the case. So at the moment we've got those 2 side intake fans, 3 intake fans on the bottom and 1 exhaust fan. We'll then set the all-in-one cooler up as exhaust as well, so the air will be flowing from the bottom upwards. And I've shown testing of this in the review if you want to see what the thermal performance was like with a couple of different setups. So I'll link to that video in the description. Now, the other thing I'd recommend is this SATA power connector. So this plugs into the ports at the front row on the power supply unit. This then has multiple connectors on it. It will work nicely with the triple pack SATA power connector from the SL fans. So you'll see with a 3-pack of the SL Infinity wireless fans, you get this adapter, which is a cable that plugs into the SATA power connector and then it has 3 cables on it. So instead of plugging the fans directly into the motherboard, you can run the cables from them with the 4-pin connectors on them to this SATA power connector. Now, I'd recommend doing this instead of connecting directly to the motherboard because it ensures that the groups of fans get the most amount of power. It ensures that they get the right amount of power to run correctly and can be recognized and controlled easily by L-Connect, and that they're powered properly in terms of the RGB lighting. It's better and more reliable than connecting directly to the motherboard, and it also means the cables are hidden away at the back. So that's one thing worth noting, although it does mean that the fans will spin at maximum speed when the PC is first turned on. So for the mounting of the fans to the radiator, so as I mentioned, I'm using the fanless version of the Hydroshift 2 here, and then I'm putting SL Infinity wireless fans on it. This means that the fans throughout the build will be the same, but these are the standard blade fans from a triple pack. So again, I'm putting that blanking plate on the end connector, and I'm also removing the connector modules from the end of the fans so that they don't get in the way when we install them on the radiator, because otherwise these will be pressing up against part of the rad. So we're going to seat this down like this, so the wireless receiver is on one end and then the other end is protected by that plastic cover. Slide it into place like that, and then obviously that's how we're going to secure it. Now in this instance, you need to remove the screw hole covers from both sides of the fan, so from the back and from the front, because we're going to use the radiator screws that were supplied with the all-in-one cooler to secure the fans to the radiator. So obviously we need to run those screws through those holes, and then you can put the covers back on afterwards. So put the screws in, run them through, secure them, tighten them up, and then basically replacing all of those things so the covers are neatly put in place and the screws are hidden away nicely like that. So that makes fairly straightforward setup. Now in terms of the wiring, quickly looking at just coming from the Hydroshift cooler, you have 2 power connectors, which I'd recommend connecting the 4-pin cable to the AIO pump header and the 2-pin cable to the CPU optional connections, which you can see here on the top right of the motherboard. This ensures that the pump is powered correctly and is getting enough power through it. You'll then also find there's a USB connection which needs to run down to the bottom middle of the motherboard and plug into the USB port down there. This will ensure that you can control the RGB lighting and the display using Lian Li's L-Connect software. So you're looking out for these ports down the bottom, a USB port with 1 pin missing on it, so you can only plug this cable in one way, so it's pretty easy to do, and you'll plug that in there. Notice that we've got a spare free USB port as well. We'll be using that later on for the wireless adapter. Now for the mounting of the all-in-one cooler, usually you'd put it into the case like this and try and seat it in here, but what I found is that I couldn't easily get it to install in the top of the case. It basically wouldn't position into the bracketing very easily. But the good news is you can remove this bracket from the top. So there's a screw at the top middle here, and then 2 screws at either end of the bracket. Just like the bottom fan tray, the top bracket can be removed, although this is held in place with a lot more screws, so you do need to make sure you remove them all, and then obviously keep hold of them carefully. Once the bracket is removed, you can then mount the all-in-one cooler to it instead. The other thing I realized is that I'd put the fan cable the wrong way round because we want to make sure all the cables are running to the back. But on the wireless receiver, you can pop that off and you can actually flip the cable round and run it in the other direction and then put the cap back on to cover it back over. This means that the cables for the fan can then easily be run to the back of the case and hidden away from view, so it just neatens things up a bit and it makes sure all the cables are facing in the same direction, the ones from the radiator and the ones from the fans, as you can see here. So now what we're going to do is flip the rad over and mount it so that it mounts to the fan tray that sits on the top of the case. Now obviously you need to make sure the tray is the right way around. You can see the little notch at the top middle of that one, for example. That's where the back of the radiator will install. So we're then going to secure all the screws to that and then feed the cables through to the back. So from the left hand side from the fans, from the right hand side from the radiator, run those cables through to the rear and then seat the bracket back in place and then re-secure it, obviously with that middle screw and the 4 side screws. But what you'll notice here is, again, I still had difficulty getting it in. So it does require a bit of convincing in order to sit the radiator in there. Even when it's on the bracket, it was a little bit fiddly to do, but you can eventually do it. I did find it is possible to do. It was just a bit tight for some reason. Once that's done, in order to seat the cooler down, we need to remove one of those RAM sticks. If you've only got 2 sticks of RAM, it's not a problem, but I had to remove the lighting kit from that first socket so that I'll then be able to seat the cooler in place, because of the way that sits in there. First of all, put some thermal paste on there. Thermal paste is included with the cooler, and then I'd recommend using the spatula it's included to spread it across the top of the CPU so you've got a good covering there so it covers the majority of the CPU. Then peel the sticker off from the copper plate. Make sure that's removed before installation. Then you've got to carefully seat the cooler down over the socket that we installed earlier on. So you have to move it from the right hand side to the left, seating it into those brackets that we put above and below the CPU. Obviously taking care not to wiggle it around too much because you don't want to ruin the thermal paste. Then we use the 4 thumb screws to secure the various different corners here. So you've got 4 corners that need to be secured. Start by hand, and then I recommend using a screwdriver to make sure those are tightened up fully. At this point, if you want to, you can use the little tube bracket that's included with the cooler to neaten up the tubes a little bit and pop that into the top. So it basically goes between those and holds the tubes so they're nice and neat and tidy. And then you'll find that's sorted out and installed, and you can pop this little cover over the top of the screws so that everything's hidden away and nice and clean there as well. So that covers over the standoffs and everything there. And then we can put that lighting kit back in so that the 4 sockets are filled back up again. But that just means that that's now ready and prepped. Now for the wiring, running the cables from the fans first of all. So from this side, running that across up to the top port here. Now, I would recommend in this instance connecting this up to the CPU fan. That way the motherboard will know there's something connected and cooling the CPU. So get the 4-pin cable, the one with 4 cables on it, and plug it into the CPU fan header up here. And that will ensure that that's powered properly and those 3 fans have the power they need. And then as a reminder, the other cables, so these 2 cables running from the radiator, those will plug in to the AIO pump header and the CPU optional header. Or if you don't have CPU optional, use the chassis fan header for the 2-pin cable connections. But those are on the right hand side here, as you can see on this motherboard. So that's the radiator and the fans powered. And then don't forget the USB cable, which is essential to be able to control the display on the cooler from Lian Li's L-Connect software and have full control over that. So that plugs into the middle bottom of the motherboard. At this point, I'd recommend doing a test boot of the system to make sure everything's working properly. Plug in the power cable, turn on the power supply unit, press the power button on the case, and hopefully you'll see all the fans light up and spin and the display on the cooler too. Now turn it all off again, and now we're going to set up the wireless dongle. So this comes with the triple pack of wireless fans. You can plug it directly into the back of the motherboard and just use a USB port there, but I prefer to put it into the case and hide it away. So use this adapter cable that plugs into one end of this little wireless controller, which you can see is a little bit fiddly because the cable will only plug in one way round. But you plug that in and then you have two connectors on it. One has to run to the chassis fan header on the motherboard and the other one to the spare USB port. So nestle this little thing away at the back of the case. I hid mine behind where the hard disk drive ports would go, tucking it away out of sight underneath the Velcro ties here in a position where it will be completely hidden, but it will still give good signal back here, so not to worry about that. What we can do is hide it away here and then run the cables through to the front and plug them into the motherboard. Also, you'll have plenty of length in the cable from this position to be able to do it. But it does mean that you can secure it with those Velcro ties. So these cables plug into the chassis fan header because it requires power. So it needs to plug into a system fan header to get power from the motherboard, and the USB port on the motherboard as well, so that they can be controlled with L-Connect. So this allows you to send signal to the fan so you can change the RGB lighting and effects on them really easily. At this point, remove all the stickers from the fans and basically make it so it looks really nice set up there without any fingerprints on it, hopefully. And then we can go about the setup and installation of everything else in the build, because obviously we need to install the GPU. But before that, if you're going to use a wireless cable like this RGB extension cable from Lian Li, it's worth knowing a few things. So it's worth checking, for example, that it will fit nicely into your GPU, because you can see here that the cable is the wrong way around, so the connector is actually upside down on the cable. However, it is possible to take this apart, unscrew it, flip the cable over so that the adapter will then work properly the other way. So you have to remove the screws and the clips from both ends and basically put the cable on the other side. So you're going to take all these clips off, the clips at this end and the other end, and the clear plastic clips in the middle. We're going to flip the RGB cable onto the other side and then flip the connector over so that it is then seated the other way, facing the other way up. You need to check whether you need to do this beforehand, because on some GPUs you might not need to, but on some instances you can see the 12-volt high power connector is basically the other way around to what we need. So I had to seat this in, push it back together, re-secure the 4 screws, and then it'll be able to push it in there later on. First of all, it's also worth noting there's a hole at the bottom of the case with this rubber space where you can run the strimmer cable through from the back. And that's because of those fat connectors on it. It might make it difficult to get it under the motherboard otherwise. So you can basically run it through like I am doing here, with one end obviously facing towards the power supply unit, so we can plug the power cable into it, and then the other end will obviously plug into the GPU in a minute. So we're using the 600 watt 12 volt 2x6 connectors, which plug into this port on the bottom of the power supply unit. Make sure that's fully pushed in. Notice it's got blue pins on it, so it's really obvious that it's fully connected all the way. And the other end of the cable plugs into the wireless RGB extension lead, and then you'll want to tidy these cables up and basically secure them at the rear so it's nice and neat. For the installation of the GPU, you then need to remove the PCIe brackets from the back of the case that are going to be in the way. So I found that was the top 2 for my graphics card. If you've got a 3-slot one, for example, you will need to remove more. But remove those, insert the GPU into the X16 slot, push it in carefully there until it clicks in, and then use the screws that came off those brackets to re-secure that end of the graphics card so it's held in place nicely there. And then you should be able to plug your power cable into the GPU nice and easily here, making sure it's fully seated and tidied up. At this stage, you'll note that there's a anti-sag bracket at the front of the case here as well that you can adjust and move around. With the thumb screws down the bottom, you can reposition it according to where your GPU is and the length of it. You can also adjust the height up and down here. So reposition this so that it sits under your GPU but doesn't interfere with the fans, and then adjust the height of it so it's supporting your graphics card and stops it from sagging over time. This is well worth doing. Next up, I'm going to show you how to install hard disk drives and SSDs. So with that tray that we removed earlier on, you can open it up like this and then insert either an SSD, a 2.5 inch, or a 3.5 inch hard disk drive into it. I'm using a hard disk drive in this instance. and you can put that into the cage, obviously with the ports facing outwards so that you can easily connect your cables to it in a little while. This will then allow you to close the thing up, and then you'll use the longish screws, refer to the manuals to see which ones these are, but these are quite long, thin screws. You'll then secure it in 4 points, as you can see the screw holes lining up with these rubber washered areas on the back of the hard disk drive cage. At this stage, you'll see it's then secured, and you can see the ports easily sticking out that we'll need to connect up. You can then seat it back into the case and notch it back into place, and then re-screw it so it's tightened in there, and then use the thumb screws to fully secure it. We'll then plug in data cables, which you should have got with your motherboard, from there, and then run that through to the front, and it will plug into the SATA ports, which you'll find usually on the bottom right hand side of the motherboard, so you can see it here. In this motherboard, there's 4 of them that located there. You run the cable through at the rear, but you'll find it's quite tight. I also found that the anti-sag bracket got in the way a little bit, so it made it quite difficult to be able to plug these cables in. That's something to watch out for. Maybe do it before the GPU is installed, or you might have to reposition the anti-sag bracket in order to be able to install these cables in there if you're using drives at all. We then need a SATA power connector, so plug that into the front row of power supply cables, and then you can plug the connector into the hard disk drive. Now obviously you can do this twice, you can have 2 of these drives in those bays if you want to. Alternatively, if you're just using SSDs, I suggest using the SSD tray is easier. You require 4 rubber washers per drive, so you can see I've got 2 crucial drives here, and then the thin, long screws that you can see me getting out of the box here. So these basically secure through the rubber washers, the idea being that they'll end up sticking through that back plate so that they can be secured in there into the holes on that basic mounting plate that sits at the back of the case. This enables you to put 2 drives on the rear of it and then plug the cables in really easily, but then hide it all away behind this tray. So they slot into place like that, and then can be tightened up on the other side so they're fully and easily secured in there. So they end up looking like this with the ports visible so you can easily plug them in. So you'll then run the SATA power cable, which is the same one we used for the hard disk drive a minute ago, and plug that into the port. Notice that you can daisy chain multiple different connectors onto it, so you can plug multiple drives into that one cable without a problem. You'll then need 2 additional data cables to run from the drives, plugging in there and then running them through to plug in to the motherboard on the right hand side for those SATA ports, as I showed you a minute ago. So run that cable through to the front so that we can plug those connectors in. And then you want to re-secure this plate to the back of the case once you're sure that everything's obviously fully connected and working properly. So screw that in with that tiny little screw we removed right at the beginning of the video, and then that's finalized. We can then put the top plate back on, so you can re-secure that with the thumb screws, and then you can start putting the back plate and the glass back on as well. So the back sits on really easily, but when you go to put the glass panels on, it's worth noting that you'll first want to remove the plastic cover from the inside. So there's a little plastic sticker on the inside of that front one, for example. Take that off, re-secure it by putting the little hooks over the bottom, push it back into place, and then repeat the same process with this side glass panel. We will first remove that plastic sheet from the inside, otherwise you'll find it won't look very nice once it's fully finished, and then hook that over at the bottom and push that back into place as well. And then you'll want to screw that in at the rear so it's fully secured, and then you'll find there's more plastic peel to be done on the front and on the side glass panel as well, so you can just take that off, and then you'll have a very nice looking PC, hopefully, and nicely fully built. Now, I'd recommend, if you have connected any of the fans to system fan headers, go into the motherboard BIOS, find the fan control section, and head over to that, and then change those fan ports that you have used to PWM mode under the fan control. This will ensure that the fans have got the proper amount of power if you're not using the SATA power connectors, and that they'll run properly and give you the right RGB lighting nice and easily every time you boot up. If you set them to another mode, you might find they don't work properly, which is why I recommend using the SATA power connector as an alternative. And then save and exit, and then obviously go about the process for installing Windows, and then download L-Connect, and then you'll be able to adjust the RGB lighting on the fans and the strimmer, and obviously the pump as well. Change the display on that. As mentioned, I've got wiring and setup guides on all of these things that I'll link to in the description. We'll go into a lot more detail on each of them if you need it for the fans or for the Hydroshift, for example, and a review on the case if you want to find out more about how my build worked. But hopefully you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments what you think, and thanks very much for watching, especially if you've made it all the way to the end. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thank you. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend, you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.